were you teaching when you started writing, or did you stop teaching to become a writer?
Oh, that's kind of a hard question because I started writing as a child. And so
Oh.
have done that basically all the way through. I got back into fiction writing mostly for stress relief, I think around 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And then um, it was not until 2000 and I think the end of 2011 because
Mm-hmm.
I started my website December of 2011. I just haven't noticed that recently. So that's really about the time I started going full time. And I left teaching at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had transitioned from a teaching role to I was working with one of the local teaching hospitals in developing
Oh.
physicians as teachers.
Ah.
And I had one of those bosses who
Mm.
kind of had a mental breakdown
Oh
and
no.
it didn't go well. And so, sometimes you look at things and think, okay, I can cut my losses now, or I can continue to try to barrel through here. And
Mm.
the writing is on the wall. This is not going to go well.
Mm.
So I decided to cut my losses and sat down with my husband and said, well, how about giving this a try?
Welcome to Story Power, a bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I chat about stories and creativity in all different styles and formats. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and my goal is to promote what Dale Carnegie stated in his famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He said, instead of condemning people, let's try to understand them. Let's try to figure out why they do what they do. That's a lot more profitable and intriguing than criticism, and it breeds sympathy, tolerance, and kindness. To know all is to forgive all. It's my firm belief that the goal of most creative people is to try to understand themselves and others. That's what makes artwork of all kinds so compelling. But more than that, the personal stories of my guests promote understanding as well. Roger C. Schenck, a cognitive scientist, said, human beings are not ideally set up to understand logic. They are ideally set up to understand stories. It's my hope that Story Power will help us understand each other better by sharing the stories of my guests. Today, I'm talking to one of my favorite authors. I am proud to say one of my favorite authors, Maria Grace. This is episode 95. Maria, I am so excited to talk to you again. Welcome
I'm
to the
so excited
show.
to be with you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so I talked to you for Patreon sometime back after I think I was in the middle of your Jane Austen and Dragons series, and I absolutely loved it. And I've read everything, even the little like the Christmas one that you did.
Oh yeah, those are such fun.
That was fun. I loved the adjacent ones too, where you're talking. The stories are about different kinds of dragons, and in the different towns and stuff. So that was really fun. I liked that as well, but I just finished reading your Righting Old Wrongs, writing as in WRIGHTING. And so it's a new series, and I want you to talk about both of those. But first, I was reading your bio again, and you have this term gas lamp fantasy. And when I saw that a while back on your website, I said, gas lamp fantasy. I think I know what that is, but could you tell about that?
Basically, it's the fantasy analog to steampunk, as steampunk is to science fiction. Gaslamp is to fantasy. They're very adjacent genres. And basically, what sets Gaslamp apart from the more typical fantasies is the history, the period of history that it's set in. Most fantasy is kind of set medieval.
Right.
And then we have urban fantasy, which is set today.
Mm-hmm.
Gaslamp is in the modern era, roughly from the 1700s through the Edwardian period in the early 1900s.
Uh-huh.
So it is fantasy with technology, but not today's technology.
Right.
And so that is one of the things that I lean into with the Wrights is the issue of the industrial era butting up into this fantasy world. And one of the things I hope to explore, and don't ask me how it turns out because I have no idea at the moment, but seriously, these things just kind of happen. But what happens when you have this fantasy world facing industrialization, and what does that do to the people who are straddling both sides?
Yeah, because I pointed out the is it CJ? What is her name? The other one that I thought was sort of like yours. Now I have to look her up.
Yeah, it's been a hot minute since I read the book myself.
Yeah, CJ Archer, I think her name is, and they were similar because her character is a clockmaker, but she has these certain magical skills that kind of go with that.
Right.
And not all the people in the guild that she is trying to get full membership into have that magical thing. And I was thinking when I read this book, the writing book, it's not exactly magical skills that Rebecca has.
Right.
It's more she's really in touch with the elements.
Exactly. And that's how I envisioned this, because magical systems always kind of hitch in my brain because they're actually very complex to construct. So I kind of lean into the non-magical magical world, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Like in my dragon series, the way dragons hide is because only a small percentage of the population has the genetic accentuated hearing, so they can hear outside the normal range of human hearing and thus actually hear the dragon's voices.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's the mechanism that I lean into there to keep the dragons hidden. With the Wrights, actually, it's kind of interesting because I was sitting down one day, and I tend to compulsively read a lot of things. So the breadth of articles that pass through my news feed that I spend time on is sometimes a little scary, and the range that it covers. But I was reading some articles on neurodiversity, and I have a lot of friends who are either themselves neurodiverse or their children or families are.
Oh, yeah.
And my own family kind of borders on that.
Oh, yeah.
So, I was just kind of thinking about how differences in nervous systems and sensitivities to the outside environment impact people. And then the writer brain kicked in. And I got to thinking, what if one of those aspects of neurodiversity might mean a sensitivity to things at the molecular level? And would allow a person to interact with the environment at the molecular level. And since that, in that era of history, the idea of molecular science was not very well developed. I pulled the Aristotelian tradition of the four elements.
Right, yeah.
And that's where I built the initial understanding of the Wrights, which is now being challenged by the industrial era.
Right. Yes. Because machines are taking over some of the things that they can do.
Exactly. And I have the skill or the ability set to kind of mimic language acquisition. Like I said, I have a very weird background and draw from a lot of strange places. But one of the things that we have known about language development is that there is this critical period up to puberty where if you are not exposed to language, it is difficult or impossible to acquire that ability, even though the human brain is wired for it. And so the skill of the Wrights is similarly wired that if it's not tapped into and trained and developed by puberty, that skill is lost. And traditional apprenticeships had allowed for that to happen, for the talent to be identified and picked up on and trained by masters. But with the increase in industrialization, apprenticeships are disappearing.
Right.
And so the likelihood of identifying those people, it has gone down and down and down. And now they're being faced with extinction, not because the talent is going away in the gene pool, but because the mechanism by which it's tapped and developed is going away.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yes. I liked that the boy that we meet in the first chapter.
Mhm.
At some point I went, I wonder if he's got the talent.
Mhm.
And spoiler alert, and then he does. Of course, that's not the main part of the story, but
Yeah, and actually, I didn't know that was going to happen until I wrote the ending of the book.
oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, I loved it. And the other thing that I like about that book is that, and the way Archer writes about these women too, who are the main characters, is we get to see the things that women today still go through.
Mhm.
But it's at a distance now because it's in the
Mhm.
1800s, and
Right.
and it's like, oh man, we're still there, you know. Okay, yeah. So that's one of the things I liked too about the Jane Austen. I read this book and I'm not sure I can read it. It's about Jane Austen and how she
Mhm.
was a real forward thinking feminist kind of person way back when she wrote her books. And it's a nonfiction book.
Mhm.
And it's on my shelf over there, but I can't read it. Anyway, and so that's the thing that you kind of pick up on in the Jane Austen and Dragon series too, is the Blue Order is run mostly by men, and they don't really, some of them would like to keep it that way.
But there are female officers in the order, which for that era is very forward thinking.
That's true.
And they're powerful female dragons that are driving all of that,
Mm-hmm.
which I find it's a really interesting dynamic to try to work with in terms of the society, and how does that get balanced between the secret life of the order and the public life, because they're living this kind of double reality.
Yes, right. Yeah, right. Well, and that's the other thing I liked about the Jane Austen and Dragon series was we humans like to think we're dominant,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the questions about dominance and or the things you point out about dominance among not just among the dragons, but are dragons dominant to humans, and how does human dominance play out? So I really like that whole mix in those books as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been interesting because I have to admit it's kind of changed the way I view some interactions in real life. Because
Oh.
I'm actually seeing some of the posturing and the bluster and the striving for dominance in people that really wasn't paying attention to it before this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even with your background, which I was reading that and I went, "Oh my goodness, I thought I had a lot of education." I thought I had a lot of degrees, but you have these degrees that are adjacent to the kinds of education I had with theater, where
Mhm.
we're trying to figure out characters and play characters. And
Right.
yours is all about brain science and cognitive, what was the about personalities and things like that.
Mhm.
So it's like it's the same thing. It's just a little, yours is more scientific.
Yeah.
That's all. Yeah, I love that. And that probably helps drive your characters when you're creating your stories.
It gives me a lot of things to draw from. I can't say that most of the time I'm specifically thinking in terms of those theories or
Mhm.
that background as I'm going, but it's sitting in the back of my head. And
Mhm.
I've got I read a lot of studies and synopsis of studies and those kinds of things, and those creep in to plots and character development, whether I want them to or not. They just kind of sneak in there.
Oh, yeah. Well, I used to tell my actors, what you do is you build up this background for your
Mhm.
character because we all have one. We all
Right.
have a background. But when we are out in the world and something happens, we're not thinking about our background. Oh, I'm
Exactly.
reacting this way because of this in my background.
Hmm.
But so if you have that as your character, if you have that background for them, then you can just forget all that and just
Hmm.
go on with the play. Now, I was going to ask too, you taught for 16 years. What did you teach?
I taught actually kind of a breadth of things. I taught intro psychology. I taught human growth and development from the undergraduate level to the doctoral level.
Uh-huh.
I taught human learning the same way from the undergraduate to the doctoral level.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I taught um, counseling methods, research methods, survey methods, basic statistics,
Mm-hmm.
testing and measurement. And I'm sure there was something else in there.
Yeah. So were you teaching when you started writing, or did you stop teaching to become a writer?
Oh, that's kind of a hard question because I started writing as a child. And so have
Oh.
have done that basically all the way through. I got back into fiction writing mostly for stress relief, I think around 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And then um, it was not until 2000 and I think the end of 2011
Mm-hmm.
because I started my website December of 2011. I just happened to notice that recently. So that's really about the time I started going full time. And I left teaching at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I had transitioned from a teaching role to I was working with one of the local teaching hospitals in developing
Oh.
physicians as teachers.
Ah.
And I had one of those bosses who
Mm.
kind of had a mental breakdown
Oh
and
no.
it didn't go well. And so, sometimes you look at things and think, okay, I can cut my losses now, or I can continue to try to barrel through here. And
Mm.
the writing is on the wall. This is not going to go well.
Mm.
So I decided to cut my losses and sat down with my husband and said, well, how about giving this a try?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we did.
Yes, and you've been very successful because you've won a lot of awards.
Yeah, I try not to pay attention to that too much because you just have to keep pressing forward.
Right. I mean, yeah, you're not resting on your laurels. It's just something that happened. Well, I just submitted my first novel. They came up with, some organization came up with a legacy
Mhm.
award. And so I submitted my first novel for the Legacy Award because it's been out
Congratulations.
for a while. And I don't know if I'll win anything, but I thought it was kind of fun.
Yeah.
I submitted it in a couple of different categories. Now that
Mhm.
takes a lot of work though, you have to pick which ones you're going to
Mhm.
submit the book to and stuff like that. But I think that's great that you have won these awards because does that motivate you though when you win awards like, oh, okay, I can do this? Do you ever get to the place where you're like, I'm not sure I can do this?
Daily? I mean, imposter syndrome is a huge thing for, well, just about everybody, but writers, it's our, our daily companion. Like at some point in time, someone is going to realize I am simply faking this, and I've been faking it for a long time, and they're going to catch on.
Well, faking it. Someone told me this, just fake it until you make it. And
Which is
it's
great advice, except nobody tells you what does it look like when you made it. How do you know that you have?
right. Yes. Well, I think for me, it was not that I'm like a really great writer or anything, but I think it was for me, it was when I feel comfortable writing. And I'm writing for me. And if other people like it, that's really great. But it's mostly I'm my audience.
Yeah.
And once I got to that point, it's not that I don't have imposter syndrome ever, but it was less. It was a lot less. So now working on my second novel, I feel, it's okay. It's okay to keep writing it and working on it. So, but you've written a whole bunch more. I haven't even touched your other gas lamp series about the Darcys and the all the Jane Austen stuff. So, what did you start with? What was your first series?
That was Given Good Principles, and the first book in that is Darcy's Decision, and it's more a straight Austen adaptation. My first, I guess, probably it's about half the books now, because I Writing Old Wrongs, I think, was number 34.
Oh,
that I've published.
Wow.
More or less. When you've got several anthologies and things you participated in, it kind of gets a little fuzzy. How do I count that? It's not,
Right.
I mean, I just did a little part of that. Is that anyway? I think about half of mine still fall under the more the Regency romance or straight Regency genre.
Uh-huh.
And that was just kind of, one day I was just thinking, well, what if, and started writing for my own sake. And at that point in time, I was hanging out with some folks who were publishing, and it was, well, why not try it?
Right.
Why not?
Yeah. Now, why did you choose Jane Austen?
I have no idea. I think at the time, that's just the thing that caught my imagination, because prior to that, like I said, I've been writing for decades, and I really tended to camp in the fantasy space opera kind of realm. And this was a huge deviation for me. 17 books worth of a deviation, but it was definitely a different path. I think it was good because during that time, I learned a lot about the craft. I learned a lot about history. I learned a lot about what I liked to write and what I didn't, what I enjoyed reading. So I kind of lean into what I enjoy reading when I write. It's like I try to write what I would like to read.
Right. Yes.
And I'm definitely, at my heart, I love exploring fantasy and some of the lighter science fiction, the space opera that isn't the heavy science or necessarily the dark military kind of stuff. I love character-driven stories. That's where I really find my niche. That's what I want to read. And that's what I like writing. I admire people who can plot these intricate thrillers and those kinds of things. That's not my happy place personally.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I was thinking too, the dialogue, because I haven't read any of your Regency stuff, but I have read people who can do continuations of Jane Austen stories, and it's like, man, they have the dialogue down because the way sentences are constructed are different or were
very
different
much so
back then. And so, yeah. And I remember when I was in high school, I fell in love with classic British literature. And I remember the first ones that I read, sometimes I would have to read the sentence 2 or 3 times before I understood what was going on.
Right.
What they were saying, because the sentences are constructed differently. The way they talked was different, not as different as Shakespeare, but still different. And so how do you do that? How do you construct those sentences?
I just listen to the characters in my head and go with that. And sometimes it's a little truer to I think one of the other challenges we run into with that is that we're also dealing with a different literary style, a different literary tradition. And so We actually do not know if that's how people talked or
Right.
that's how people wrote.
Oh, that's true.
Does that make sense?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Because we don't have any recordings from
Right.
the era. We just have what people wrote. But, we write in very strange ways with abbreviations and emojis
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't necessarily reflect the way people talk.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to tell really what would have been true to the period. And I just listen to the characters in my head and try to reflect that on paper rather than getting too tied up. I know some authors strive so hard to be accurate to Austen's style and her period that you can find online lists of all the words Austen actually used. Her vocabulary, and they will adhere to that. And I have every respect for someone who feels compelled to do that and can pull it off well. That's not where I am. And so I try to be careful not to use very modern language to avoid, certain modern constructions. But I try to strike a balance between that and readability. And just striking the right feel.
Yes, because I was thinking that when I read 14 books of the Jane Austen and Dragon series, that the dialogue felt like that period. And maybe, I guess I didn't really compare it to Jane Austen specifically, but it just felt like the way they talked was part of that period, even if it might be a little, maybe not exactly the way she would have constructed the sentences or something.
And that's really what I was aiming for.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, because go ahead.
But my goal is to create a world that's easy to drop into so that the writing vanishes and you're immersed in the story and in the world.
Yes.
That's what I like to read, is something that I can just drop into. And I'm no longer paying attention to the vocabulary, the sentences, or any of those things. I'm just there in the story.
Yeah. Right.
And so that's what I try to do. And sometimes, one of the things that was very prevalent in writing in that era, and it's funny because I notice it especially in old cookbooks, is they only put a period at the end of the paragraph. Everything else was separated by semicolons. So you can have technically a sentence go on for 15 lines separated by semicolon after semicolon after semicolon. And that's a bear to read because our brains don't process those semicolons the way that they used to be, because to us, they mean something different. And we're craving that end of the sentence, give me capital letter to reorganize my thoughts with.
Right. Yeah.
And little things like that can be enough of a distraction to prevent you from being able to drop down into the world.
Right.
Because you're fighting so much to get over some of the stylistic things.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Now, how do you publish? Do you publish through a publishing house, or did you create your own publishing house, or what?
I'm entirely self-published.
Oh, okay.
Everything that I've researched in the industry, which has just turned upside down since 2008. In 2008, with the advent of the e-reader, the publishing industry turned upside down and inside out probably twice by now. It is phenomenally different than it was 15 years ago.
Right.
And that includes the issue of gatekeeping and authors being able to make a living. As an independent author, I do a lot better than I would being traditionally published. And I have so much more control to allow for example, the cover to be what I think it needs to be, to write the sales copy, to market it. There was just a study released very recently that talked about how traditional publishers spend a tiny fraction of their budgets on marketing, and they only market after you've proven that the book's going to sell.
Right. Yeah.
Which is a little bit backwards.
Yeah.
The structure of advances severely limits what authors can make. Advances are not very much, especially after you back out paying the agent and those kinds of things. And most books don't earn out their advance, which translates to they don't get any royalties. And even if you were to get royalties, it's pennies.
Right.
So financially, it's very difficult to do well as a traditionally published author. People do it, and kudos to them. But when you write in a niche like gaslamp fantasy or steampunk science fiction or even some historical fantasy, if you look at it, there are very, very few traditionally published authors. And then the rest are independent. Part of the reason is the amount of reading public who will read the standard bestseller genre is huge compared to the very niche market of gaslamp or steampunk or some of these other smaller genre. So the big publishers, they can't afford to invest in it because they're not going to make back their investment.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Barry and I did that too. We published mine independently, and he did the cover and the layout, and because he's a graphic artist and he does newsletters and he does editing, and so it was really a great thing. And just I've sold maybe 5 copies last year, and the book came out in 2017. It was like, oh, how did people find my book? Because I don't do a whole lot of marketing with it. But, I do have something about it on my blog, and I mention it periodically on my podcast. And so I think that's maybe how people find me. But I'm not, I wanted to control it too. And I was in my 60s, when I published it. I didn't want to wait for, and I didn't want someone telling me, oh, I'm sorry, but you can't have this on the cover, or you can't, I wanted to control it myself. So I'm with you. I wanted to control. I like the control of it myself. And, it's out there, even if it's not being published by a big publishing house.
The other thing is, you said it came out in 2017. The fact that you have it independently published means it's still available. Books that were written in 2017 are largely certainly not available in bookstores, with the exception of a few classics.
Right.
Books turn over like bad fruit. I mean, they're there and then they're gone. Where having it independently published and having it published as an ebook makes it very evergreen and accessible for a very long period of time. Yeah, which is another huge advantage.
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah. And the other thing that I was going to say about that is that I can market it again. I can, and I am not a big reader of the new and shiny. I don't know what it is about me, but I want a book to be around for a while before. And if people are still talking about it 5 years later, I'm like, well, maybe that might be a good book to read, So I think it was Dan Brown's the one that exploded. Da Vinci Code. And my first degree is in religious studies, so I was really interested in that topic. But I kind of waited. I waited to see if people liked it. And so I think it was 2 or 3 years after it got published that I finally read it. And then shortly after that, I found another series. The Expected One is the first of that series, and it's like Dan Brown, but it's written by a woman. The series is written by a woman. I think her name is Kathleen McGowan. And I'll put it in the show notes. And those 3 books takes place over a much longer time than the Da Vinci Code, which is only like 48 hours or something. But the subject matter is basically the same. And I liked it much better. I liked her series much better with a female protagonist. And, it was like, oh, yeah, I kind of remember studying that in religious studies, the whole idea that maybe Jesus might have been married and, things like that. So, yeah, I bought 2 copies of the first book because it was like sitting on a table for $6.99 or something, and so we had gone into Tucson to go to a play, and we had dinner, and then Barnes and Noble was right behind the restaurant, and we had some time to kill before we went to the theater, and that's how I found that book. So the next time we went to Tucson, I got another one so I could give it away not give it away, but lend it out, know. And so that I love that series. So and it's 2 timelines, So I also like that. I do want to talk a little bit more about your new series and if you have any ideas where it's going to go. I know you kind of are the kind of writer like I am. You start something and then you see where it takes you, but you might have some ideas. So,
well, I have the next book outlined. I was actually on a trip to speak to a group in Louisville, and I got delayed, a 3-hour flight delay. So I sat in the airport with nothing to do but a blank notebook, which is a dangerous thing to give a writer. And so I outlined the next book
cool.
then. So we'll pick up just shortly after this book ends. And it looks like there is a school about to happen, which is kind of where we left off last time, that Rebecca had been commissioned to start a school for possible female rights. So that's largely what we're going to be exploring in the next book.
Cool. Yeah.
And that's going to have all sorts of interesting facets, from who exactly the students are, because the guild has agreed to identify the students at this point for her.
Yes.
So I think we're going to get a very interesting mix of individuals. And then chances are she's going to find one of her own along the way, just because that seems to be the kind of thing that would happen. And in the meantime, David is going to be contending with guild reformations and dealing with legal matters for the guild, and trying to wrangle that intersection of the guild and their need for secrecy with the demands of the modern world.
Right.
So he's got a lot of challenges there. And of course we still have them, and I love the way their budding romance got interfered with by the guild deciding that reading 2 rights together might be a good thing, and they like each other, and they're faced with this interference on the side. And I just kind of loved a very frank conversation that they had, where he asks her at the end of the last book, well, does this matter to you? And I just think that's such fun with their characters, because it's such an atypical kind of romance.
Yes.
But,
right.
It also just feels very natural, and the way they would be.
Yes.
Because they're both pretty frank, forthright, down to earth people.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right. And then I have some ideas for the book after that, where things are going to get more complicated. I don't want to give away too much, but the things that lead up to the 3rd book were laid out in the 1st book. If you read it carefully, some interesting things are going to happen in David's future that are completely, for him anyway, unexpected. And will lead to some interesting dilemmas to try to navigate.
Yes. One of the side characters that I just really loved was Birdie.
Oh, I love her. She is such fun.
She is fun. And I'm hoping that she's going to be in more books because I really liked her.
Well, she'll definitely be in the next book. I know that for sure.
Oh, good.
And
Okay.
I have not figured out enough about the third book to figure out how to bring her in, but she's just such fun.
She is fun. Yeah. And supportive and nurturing.
Mhm.
And yeah, which poor Rebecca didn't really have that.
Yeah. And she's also very savvy and very smart because she has been owning a very successful public house on her own
Right.
and running it. Now, mind you, she has kind of a rough clientele, but she makes ends meet. She runs a very successful business in an environment that isn't necessarily very helpful to women in that position.
Yeah, it helps that she's a really good cook.
Yes, it does. But I mean, that's what her business is founded on, being a really good cook.
Yes.
But she's got to have some business smarts and just solid good sense in order to put that together and make it work.
Yes, right. Yeah. Yeah, her clientele. I know it was sort of left hanging. You could kind of guess when she handed over a box of more personal items for Rebecca to repair. And Rebecca's like, oh, I wonder what happened. And we don't know what happened exactly, but at some point I thought, well, at some point we might find out,
When I find out.
Yeah, someplace down the line we might find out about that. Yeah. So, and I like the solution of, I forgot the boy's name. What is the boy's name?
Fletcher.
Oh yeah, Fletcher. I couldn't remember that. I liked what happened with Fletcher too at the end because, his dad, oh my goodness.
Not a nice character, is he?
No, not at all. Not at all. So I'm really
but he very much fits the social stereotype and the reality. If you look at money lending in the Victorian era, oh my gosh, you want to talk about a dirty business.
Oh yeah.
It was a very dirty business, and there wasn't a great deal of regulation.
Oh yeah. Well, and I liked that. I mean, when he did what he did to Rebecca with the contract, I said, oh, she has to be one of many. One of many that he's done this to. She's not the only one. Even though supposedly they were going to get married. I don't think she ever really say she would marry him. It was just her father's.
If I remember correctly, and unfortunately I've written so many words, we're past the 1,000,000-word mark on the Dragon books. So sometimes this stuff gets a little foggy.
Right.
But she did agree to marry him and then found him with somebody else.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And so that's it.
Yeah. She didn't want to marry him though, really.
No, she was caught in that very traditional, this is my only choice kind of scenarios.
Yes, right. Yeah, right.
And then she discovered she really did have another choice.
Yeah. Good for her. Good for her. She has gumption.
Yes.
So I'm really happy that you talked to me again. Do you have anything else you want to say before we go?
Whenever someone says that to me, my mind goes absolutely blank. One thing that is a lot of fun, I go on these research rabbit trails for the different books. Like one of the things that came up in the first Wrights book was the Wardian case, which was a Victorian trend for these very elaborate kind of self-contained terrariums.
Oh.
And so there are a lot of little things like that. The Chubb detector locks, which are absolutely fascinating, that also featured in there. And I love to do small articles explain the research behind those little details and how that, they really were a thing. This wasn't just an invention for the book. And those are on my website. I have a bunch of them related to the Dragon books already. The last one, Here There Be Dragons, with the sea dragons and the history of sharks, how people knew about sharks in the Regency era, and little details like that I think make the world so much fun.
Yes.
So, for other research nerds like me, hop on over to Random Bits of Fascination, where I have all of that stuff available to kind of spice up the world a little bit.
Yeah, and sometimes, well, I don't read every single email that you send out your newsletter, but yeah, sometimes you do have little tidbits about your research on there too. So that's kind of it. So sign up for that.
and that sign up form is on the website as well.
Yes, it is. And that's where I read, I set it aside, and then a few days later I came back, and that's where I read the first chapter of Writing Old Wrongs. And I said, oh, this is really fun. I can't wait till this one comes out. So yeah, I used some of my Christmas money to get your book and read it because it was really fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I did. So keep writing.
I will.
Oh, good. You have 2 series now that you can go back.
Yes, it's kind of exciting.
It is, yeah. Oh, I'm bored with this one. I think I'll go work on this other series over here.
It's more like, which characters are shouting the loudest at me right now? I have to quiet them down.
I suppose that's true. Yes, I suppose that's true. Well, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to me again, Maria. And I just love your books, and I tell people about them. I tell a lot of people, and I write in Goodreads, I write little reviews for you so that hopefully
I so appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, because reviews, as someone put on LinkedIn, are the thing that help authors the most.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah, it does. It does. So, and independent authors need those reviews. So
yeah, we really do.
Yeah. Well, thank you again. And I'm sure I will be calling you, or
I will look forward to it
again. Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a rating and/or review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. I invite you to join my Patreon community at patreon.com/storypower, all one word. Or if you like, you can subscribe to Story Power on Apple Podcasts. It's my aim to build a community where we discuss the stories we love and talk about what we learned from them. I offer extra audio content and story suggestions to my patrons on both platforms. Remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Let's spread the story love. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.